Welcome to the arithmetic zone and welcome back to our final website. In the last part of this series, we set up the long work of the timeline page by making a function to get the latitude and longitude values from a zip code that the user inputs. So if we look at our website, and if I type in a zip code like that and press submit, if I check the console, we can see that it took that zip code and it converted it into latitude and longitude using the geocoding API. Today we're going to set up the process to use the other API, the timeline weather API, so we can use the latitude and longitude values and make a timeline of the weather for the next and last 5 hours and days. So let's get started. So as you can see in my code, I already wrote a function, initTimeline, or at least I'm trying to call a function, but I didn't actually make it yet, so let's make it right now. Const initTimeline, and then because we're going to use an API, we're going to have to specify async. And then I want to specify the parameters, so length, range, lat, and lon. And I'm doing it the arrow function way, which I can set default values for. So hourly, range equals next 5, lat equals, say, I don't know, 20, and lon equals 20. And then the arrow with the equal sign and the greater than sign, and then brackets. So inside of here, we're going to call in our weather timeline API. So looking at the documentation of this API, we can see that if we want to call latitude and longitude, we copy this URL, and then after this slash, we put in the latitude, a comma, and then the longitude value. And if we want to include the date range, then similarly, we put another slash, and then we enter the dates into that ISO format I mentioned in a previous video, with this being the starting date and this being the final date, and it essentially returns the weather information for each hour and all the dates in that range inclusive. So why are we concerned about getting the weather for multiple days? Well, let's think about this. Obviously, it makes sense why we need to do this if we're checking the weather for the next 5 days or the last 5 days. But what if we want to check the next 5 hours or the last 5 hours? Well, you're going to have to account for the fact that if the user is checking your website at a specific hour, and let's say within that range of next 5 hours and last 5 hours, it's going to be a different day, you're going to have to include information for the previous day's weather and tomorrow's weather. So take me, for example, right now. I'm recording this at 8:19 p.m. If I were to check the weather for the next 5 hours, including the current hour, so that would be 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and 12 a.m. of the next day. I can't use 12 a.m. of the current day. That's going to be a common mistake that you may encounter, so we're going to have to actually retrieve the information for yesterday, today, and tomorrow just to check the hourly weather. For the daily weather, next 5 and last 5 days, that's much more simple. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the latitude and longitude information of 11693 and also take the URL of both of these sample requests, because a cool feature of this API is that you can combine the different features. So if I want to specify latitude and longitude, I just include it with a slash before, and then same thing with the date range. So let's copy this portion of the URL, which will always be constant. And I'm failing at doing that, I apologize. Now let's include the latitude and longitude. So we're going to use these values for now, because as I said in a previous video, you want to copy the JSON that you get for your first try so that you can just keep on using that when testing, because unfortunately, this API does lock out its use if you use it too many times in one day. So then you put a comma, then the longitude, and then I want to get the date range. So let's start with just hourly for now, which we're gonna need yesterday, today, and tomorrow. In my case, I'm currently recording on February 26, 2023, so we're going to need the information from February 25th to February 27th. So for the starting date, we're going to write 2023 02 25. Remember to write this in the ISO format, which is year, month, day, and then slash, and then the ending date 2023 02 27. And then going back to the documentation, then we write question mark key equals and then your API key, which you can find in your account, which I'm going to add in from here. So I'm just going to copy that and then paste, and then let's see if we get actual data. And we do. So we get the JSON for the hourly weather information starting from February 25th, which it should say somewhere here. It says it right there, date, time. As for the hour, hours are in an array right here and gives you the weather for each of the hours. And it does this for the 25th, the 26th, and the 27th right here. So as I said, want to copy all this information, go back to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to make a temporary file. So make sure you're making it in the timeline folder. And then let's write hourlyinfo.js. This is only going to be temporary, so let hourlyinfo equals, and then we paste, because this is just one giant object. Alright, and we want to reference this, so in our timeline.html we're going to have to link those two together. So script source equals hourlyinfo.js defer. Now we want to retrieve the data for the daily information, which is going to be the next 5 days and the last 5 days. Technically misleading name because I plan to include the current date within that range. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to fetch the data for a call gathering weather information from the last 4 days up to the next 4 days. So if we count that for me, February 26th, 4 days ago would be February 22nd. So right here, I'm going to adjust this. And then next 4 days from now, from February 26th, will actually be March 2nd for me. And this is going to be a challenge that we're going to have to deal with later, but we're going to also have to account for the fact that then depending on your current date, you might have to bleed into the next month. For now, it's fine because we're just writing in values, but how are we going to represent this with variables? Like, how is our variable going to know what the current date is? How is it going to know what's the date 5 days from now or 4 days before, etc.? We're going to have to use some special date functions that I'm going to get to later. But for now, let's just press enter. And then now we have the information from February 22nd all the way to March 2nd. So I'm going to, again, copy all this information. And we're going to write in another file. And we're going to call it daily info. So we're going to say let daily info equals, and then paste, and then we're going to link them together. Link the files together in the HTML page. So now that we have these sample JSON files, we don't have to call in the API anymore. Anyways, let's start this initTimeline function that we put off for a while now. Obviously, depending on what the selected length and range of the time values are, our code is gonna do different things. So let's first differentiate the methods by the length. So let's say if length is equal to hourly, and then underneath that we're going to write else, which is if the length is daily. Now usually I would try to fetch the API here, do that whole process, but for now we're just going to use our samples that we gathered earlier. So we're going to write let timeline data equals hourly info, and then we're going to write a similar statement in the else portion, but we're going to write daily info instead. And then I'm going to write another function, which is going to be called getTimeline. And then obviously getTimeline is going to have its own functions, or own parameters, sorry. And one of those parameters is going to be the JSON data that we retrieved. So we're going to write in timeline data. And then I'm also going to need the length and range values that this function is already using as parameters. So really all it's doing is just passing the length and range from one function to another. We don't need the latitude and longitude values anymore, because based on our JSON already accounted for that. So obviously these are grayed out because we haven't used them yet, but once we actually fetch out the API, we are going to be incorporating them. So we're going to write in the same parameters in the else portion. And now let's get started on actually making this new function. So const getTimeline. And then we want to write in timeline data, length, and range. We don't need default values in this case. Write in our arrow. And underneath, the first thing we want to do immediately is to clear our timeline, because every time we call this function, it's going to add in, new information. So we got to clear in the information that's already there, so we don't make more boxes of weather information that we need. So let's identify what document element refers to the timeline div that we made in our HTML page. So if you look to the top, I called it timeline divs. So we're going to write timeline divs, and a good way to clear it is to write inner HTML equals a blank string. So that's just going to clear out all the current data. And now we're going to have to put in the information depending on what the time length is. So if length is equal, we're going to do daily first because that one is definitely going to be easier to comprehend. So if the time length is daily, and then we're also going to have to account for the range. So if range is equal to next 5, we're going to have to make a for loop to iterate through the daily JSON. But here's the issue. What's our range going to be? This is for the next 5 days, and we retrieved information from the last 4 days all the way up to the next 4 days. So obviously we can't just start at int equals 0, if for next 5 at least, because then we're going to be starting at 4 days from now in the past. So if we're going to have to do a little bit of logic here. If we retrieved all of the weather information from the last 4 days all the way up to the next 4 days, and we're trying to only get today and the next 4 days, what does that mean? We're going to have to ignore the first 4 days in our JSON. So ignoring the first 4 days means we start from the 5th one. And how do we represent the 5th item with an index number? We start at I equals 4. And I accidentally wrote int because my mind was in Java for a second. So I apologize for that. So let I equals 4, which that's the 5th item. So we're going to be ignoring the last 4 days in the past. And we're going to be starting from I equals 4, which represents today. And then we're going to say I is less than timeline data dot length. So it goes up to the next 4. and then I++. So inside of here, we're gonna have to make a new div. So document.createElement div, and then we're gonna have to retrieve all the information. If we look back at the JSON when we try to call the data for the daily samples, which would be this one, we can see that days is a property, and then days is a list. And inside of this list, we can specify the date time property, which gives us the date. And we can also specify temp, which gives us the temperature of that day in Celsius. And then down here in conditions, it gives us the general weather. So we can reference all of these properties in our code, and also humidity, because why not? So go back, and then underneath right here, the first thing we should probably specify is going to be the date. So let new date equals document.createElement, and I'm thinking the size of h3. So new date is going to be set to date time. So .enter HTML, and then we're going to have to write timeline data dot days, and if you remember, days was a list, so we're going to have to write I, which represents the current day, and then date time, just like that. And then if we want to specify the general weather, which was the conditions, let new conditions equals document.createElement, and I was thinking P for this one. So new conditions dot enter HTML is equal to, again, timeline data dot days bracket I, and then it was called conditions. Next, we want to get the temperature. So I'm just gonna copy this because it's more of the same thing. Again, I'm going to use the p tag, and we're going to call this new temp. And instead of specifying new conditions, we're going to specify that property that was called .temp. And then finally, for the humidity, again, more of the same. Just going to copy it. I'm going to call it new humid. And then instead of specifying .temp, we're going to specify humidity. And then finally, of course, we're going to have to append all of these new HTML elements we created into that new div. So new div.append in this order: new date, new conditions, new temp, and new humid. And currently new div is not linked to anything, so we're going to have to link it to that timeline divs that we cleared earlier. So timeline divs.append new div. And this whole process is going to occur for each day. If you're following along, I also want you to, in this for loop header, to add .days.length. That is something that is a crucial piece I forgot, because if you don't include .days, then it's going to iterate through pretty much nothing, because timeline data is just an object with a length of 0, while the days property of timeline data is an array of all the days. So now that I included all this information, let's test out our website. So make sure it's set to daily next 5, because we didn't program anything else. So let's write in 11693, and it gives us pretty much gives us the weather of the next 5 days, including today, so the 26th all the way to March 2nd. And one of these is undefined, and the one that says undefined, that should be the weather condition. So let's see what's going on. And I accidentally called it new conditions. My bad. It should be called .conditions. So again, write daily next 5, and now it gives us the actual weather. So pretty cool. Obviously it looks terrible right now, but we can fix it with CSS later. But for now, we're gonna focus on functionality. So I think doing the next 5 days makes sense. So let's see if you can do the last 5 days. So in this else loop, you're going to write essentially the same thing, but the for loop header is going to be slightly different. How would you iterate through timeline.days so that you only get the last 4 days, including today, and not today and the next 4 days? See if you can think of a way to do it. But I'm just going to go ahead and give you guys the answer. So I'm just going to first copy this because it's essentially the exact same thing. The only difference is that the for loop header is different. So instead of iterating from 4 all the way to the end of timeline data.days, we're going to start from I equals 0 and we're going to stop at 5. So we're going to get the information for 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 because those indices represent the last 4 days and today. So from indexes 0 to 4, while this one goes from 4 to the end of that array. So now, as shown earlier, this is the information for the next 5 days of 11693's weather for the next 5 days. And if I were to do the same location, but instead of the next 5 days, the last 5, this would be the information. So from February 22nd all the way to the current day, February 26th. Obviously, looking at this right now, you can't really tell what these numbers mean. So let's go back to our code and make it a little more clear using our old friend template literals. So I just went ahead and added template literals to the weather, temperature, and humidity using again the quotes next to the 1 key on your keyboard, the $, and the brackets, so that I can cleanly integrate these object properties within these strings. And I also specified that this temperature is in Celsius and the humidity is a %. So if we go back, it should be more clear now when I enter my zip code and next 5, and there we go. Same for last 5 days. And we did it. So basically the daily portion of this is done. Obviously we're gonna have to integrate the API call later on, but now we're gonna have to focus on the hourly range, or rather the hourly length, and that one is gonna be unfortunately much more difficult. Why, you ask? Even though we're dealing with a smaller data set, we're only dealing with yesterday, today, and tomorrow, how is the program going to know what the current hour is? Because that ultimately determines what our starting index is going to be. So we're actually not going to do this today, because in the next part of this series, I'm going to go over how you can return the current date using some special methods that I did not cover earlier. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys later.